Hi, everyone. It's so great to have you today on this panel and workshop. So we are talking about the humanities in podcasting, and an important part of this seminar is starting your podcast. And I think this will give you some idea, especially for those who sort of looking forward to be a podcaster, start your own podcast. I think this will provide you some background, some information about what the three of us have experienced as podcasters from different and diverse backgrounds. I'm Thilini Prasadika from Sri Lanka, and I have my two panelists, the resource people with me today. It's a privilege and a pleasure welcoming Conor Reid. Conor is an Irish podcaster and writer. His background is in English literature, and he has a PhD in English from the Trinity College, Dublin, and has published widely on genre fiction. And in 2017, he started a podcast, Words to That Effect, a narrative storytelling show which explores the fiction that shapes popular culture. The show has grown in the years since it's been featured in the national media in several countries, and has been performed live in the UK and Ireland. On the back of its success, however, Conor moved into podcast production professionally in 2019, and he's now the head of podcast at Headstaff, a cultural media and podcast production company in Dublin. And there he has made hundreds of podcasts for everybody, from international brands and government organizations to universities and art organizations. Welcome, Conor. It's a great pleasure and privilege having you today.
Thank you.
And we have Tristan Boyle. Is a digital public archaeologist and co-founder of the Archaeology Podcast Network. He has been podcasting since the age of 16 and found his place in the archaeological podcast scene after completing a degree in archaeology with chemistry in the University of Aberdeen. He has researched podcasts, about archaeology over the last few years, and submitting a review to Advances in Archaeological Practice and a chapter to Public Arts of Engagement book. He had run starting your podcast workshops both in the real world and digitally. Welcome, Tristan, and so great to have the two of you to discuss some fundamentals of podcasting. We can actually start with Conor, if that's okay, and we can sort of see how this discussion is going to flow. Conor, how do we let's first talk about your podcast, and then we'll move on to discuss a couple of things that you think are important to our listeners.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. So, so I have a podcast called Words to That Effect, which is a podcast that looks at, as Thilini said, the fiction that shapes popular culture. So it's a kind of a documentary style podcast or a narrative storytelling podcast. So I do interviews and then I chop them up. I write a script, I voice the script, I bring it all together, and then I add some music and sound design and different elements. It's very time consuming, way too time consuming, but I really like doing it. So I persist. And yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things I learned very early on, that no matter what type of show you're making, even if you think it's a really simple, straightforward podcast, everything in podcasting takes ages. Especially as in the vast majority of cases, it's just you. So some people might be working as part of a team, or maybe you have a co-host or something like that, and you can split up the work, which I would highly advise. But it's just, there's a lot of different parts to podcasting. And if you're doing all of them, so that's the research, the finding interviews, interview guests, if you have them, thinking of questions and thinking of good episode topics, putting it all together, editing it, then getting it uploaded and online, promoting it. It's just really, really time consuming. So you know, talk to any podcaster and they will agree. And I see Tristan and Thilini nodding their heads. So hope that's an endorsement. So yeah, you need to give yourself time. In my sort of professional capacity as a podcaster, you know, we make shows for different companies and things like that, and people often come into us and they'll say, hey, we're going to make a podcast for my university department or for my company or whatever it is. And I usually ask them, like, are you the only one making the podcast, or are there going to be other people doing it? And they're like, no, I'm going to do it on, like, I have a bit of time on Friday afternoon. And I kind of say, like, yeah, okay, but it's going to take you more than Friday afternoon to sort of do it, or to do it well, or to do it consistently. And as I'm sure all of you are podcast listeners, you know, podcast listeners like consistency. If you have a show that comes out every week or every 2 weeks or every month, it doesn't really matter, but at least it comes out every 2 weeks or every month or whatever it might be, rather than just whenever, or you're going to lose your audience. So I think the first sort of thing in setting up a new show is to give yourself loads of time at the beginning to get your head around everything. If you're going to be editing the show, give yourself some time to practice editing, because it's also a skill that is very time consuming. So, you know, if you're planning on launching a new show, don't kind of say, right, 15th of October, I'll get my new show out on the, you know, 15th of November. Give yourself a couple of months to plan everything, and not only to plan the show and the structure and the guests and the types of things you're going to do with it, but also to plan how you're just going to reach an audience at the end. And we can maybe talk a little bit about that later. But you know, in most cases, you want people, one, you want people to listen, and two, you probably don't have a built-in audience. You know, maybe you have 50,000 followers on Instagram, and as soon as you put it out, you'll pick up loads of listeners. But for most of us, that's unfortunately not the case. You're kind of starting from zero, and, you know, starting with your mom and dad listening and working your way up from there. So, you know, it's something that you need to think about at the beginning as well. How am I going to find listeners? And then from there, think about your first couple of episodes, not your first episode. Think about maybe the first 3, 4, 5 episodes. And I would sort of highly recommend at the outset completely finishing and having ready to launch at least 2, ideally 3 or 4 episodes. It depends on how spaced out they are. So if you have like 4 episodes and you're releasing them fortnightly, then you've given yourself a fairly healthy 8 weeks after the first one is out to get the next one, the 5th one, made. But give yourself a bit of a buffer. I mean, I say all this and I completely don't do it myself, and then I'm rapidly running out of time, and I'm like, oh crap, I need to get a new guest, I need to get a new episode or whatever. But at least if you have a buffer and you start catching up with yourself, maybe you go from 4 episodes to 3 episodes to 2 episodes ahead, but at least you're still a little bit ahead, that you can kind of, you know, give yourself a little bit of time and that sort of thing. I think Thilini is going to talk a little bit.
Like what you said, Conor, is very interesting, and I think an idea is very important. You know, when you want to start a podcast. So I'm very curious as to how an idea, a very little seed, like, you know, develops into a full-fledged podcast, a full-fledged show. I remember when I wanted to start podcasting last year, so I'm quite new to this. And when I wanted to start it, I was very anxious, nervous, but I was excited at the same time about the idea that I had. So I wanted to talk about the crisis in the humanities, and I was using podcasting as a platform, a sort of like a place to voice what I and other people had to say. So I think I can talk a bit more about this, and I would like to talk to Tristan, ask about this idea. How can one develop an idea into a sort of a good or a very solid podcast, a platform? What do you think, Tristan?
Well, I think that this is probably the place that I start when I talk to people about podcasts in general. You know, for me, you have to know everything going on before the sound waves hit the microphone. You know, you should be kind of understanding that all that needs to be in place before you even hit the record button. And I think the great place you can start off is having many ideas. I think there's a tendency to think there's a quick way of doing it and there's an easy way of doing it. And the problem is what you put in is going to be what you put out, is what's going to come out at the end. I think the best thing to do is, as with what Conor's kind of alluded to, I would go even further. I would say like episode 1 is easy, episode 10 is easy, episode 100 is really difficult. And although I wouldn't suggest planning out all 100 episodes, you need to make something that's either sustainable or it's well contained. So like if you're going to do a podcast that's going to release monthly, think about like, well, how do I keep this going? Is it something too narrow? Can I make it broader? And so, like, for example, let's think about something like history. History is an extremely broad topic, and it's a huge way of kind of like, you can tackle so many things in it, but it could almost be too broad. If you're making a history podcast, I mean, you could easily get lost in the vastness of it. That's why we see the history of China podcast, the history of a number of different areas that are history of something specific, and they're still able to expand this small area into hundreds of episodes. So I think maybe placing yourself in the mind of, well, look, what happens if I take this forward past the first 5 episodes, past the first 10? Even if you don't have like the descriptions written out, having even the title of like the first 10 episodes gives you a framework to build off. Because I'm currently working with the heritage organization in Scotland, and we are doing a run of podcasts rather than saying, right, we're going to do a weekly podcast and it's going to go into ad infinitum, forever. We've said, look, we're going to make like 6 to 7 episodes. They're going to be neatly this length of time. They're going to be edited and they're going to be released on this schedule. And that's great because everybody's expectations are met. Everybody knows what's going on. And it allows everybody to kind of like, right, now we know where we are. We can actually start, recording stuff, editing stuff, and putting things through. I mean, I remember I was sat in a podcasting workshop a couple of months ago, and there was a really great kind of a tea break challenge where you had to come up with a brand new podcast during the tea break. And it's scary, like come up with a new podcast in 15 minutes. And so I kind of thought, right, you know what? In the area where I live, there's a lot of industrial heritage, and there used to be a caramel wafer bar factory down the road that made like toffees and chews and biscuits. And I thought, it'd be great, be a history of sweets, a history of caramel, a history of toffee. So like, what could I do with that? So I'm thinking like, well, let's look at the history of sweets in the UK. Let's look at the links to slavery and plantations, the links to sugar. That could be an episode. You could also do about the strikes and the workers' conditions in factories. And suddenly you've taken the idea of history of sweets and you've tied it to like other social and political things that then themselves can be expanded on. And that's what I think is really, really important, is that you don't box yourself in with your idea. The best thing also you need to really do is come up with a fancy name. Now, in 15 minutes, all I could get was confactory, which is kind of a play on confectionery and factory. And it's okay, but I think I need to work on it. But I think this is the thing, is like, there's no right way to do it. There's no like set list of rules, but if you give yourself the space to think and you don't give yourself this difficult timeline, like Conor was alluding to, if you give yourself the time to prepare and plan, you can achieve a lot of different things. And then it's just up to you as to how you want to set that pace. So that's kind of like how I would start the conversation.
Very interesting. I remember like my podcasting journey began as a response to being alienated from the academia. I used to be a first generation graduate student, first generation academic, and so I was trying very hard to find a voice, in an English department where different axes of identities intersect and different dynamics of power operate, um, and podcasting for me was one of the like perhaps one of the innovative ways of reaching out and having my voice heard. And I started my podcast as a broke graduate student. I didn't have enough like a whole budget backing me up, and it was also like a way of like making use of things, resources that are available to me. So the idea was to podcast about the crisis of the humanities. I wanted to focus on like Sri Lanka especially and exclusively, but that was because Sri Lanka tends to be overshadowed by the Indian subcontinent, the history and the experience and everything. So I just wanted to bring those kind of perspectives. But I think it kind of like it got me into thinking, and when I reached out to people, it kind of started evolving beyond what I thought. It started like I thought, okay, I should also reach out to other people from the global north, from the global south, and include those perspectives, accommodate those perspectives as well. And that idea that I initially had developed into something more more diverse, and not being prejudiced about what the global north has to say about the humanities, also not being biased about what the global north has to say. It's also about the global south. So it's all these kind of connections, making all these connections. Talking about the structuring of the podcast, like you guys said, having this kind of frame helps us, frame our conversations and frame what we want to do with our podcast. So Conor, could you let's talk a bit more about how to sort of structure your podcast in a way it has space to breathe and evolve beyond what you have initially thought about.
Yeah, I think there's a few things to say about that. I think there's definitely something to be said for letting podcasts evolve. And I think one of the nice things about podcasts is that, okay, I have said, they take time to make and so on and so forth, but they're still relatively quick and easy to make compared to, going off and trying to make a episode of a TV show or something like that. You can put together a podcast quite quickly, which means you can experiment quite a lot and quite easily. And, you might have big, grand ambitions for a podcast, but it might be a complete failure. And maybe you would kind of say, well, look, yeah, this podcast didn't work, but actually I learned a few things from it. Scrap it, try again. A few weeks later, you can have a new podcast up and running. And, you can kind of learn from that a little bit. So you can kind of go down that route of really trying to experiment and try new things. But I think probably more likely you'll just sort of find that the podcast maybe naturally evolves. I remember I saw a talk a good while back that was recommended to me on the Third Coast, that big American festival. Is the Third Coast Pocket Festival, I think it's called. So it's like a podcast of the talks from the festival. And one of them was about using taglines for podcasts, which I thought was really interesting. So the speaker was talking about how if you can take your podcast and give it a good tagline, which describes it really well. I think, okay, firstly, that's great because you can put it on your social media, you can put it on your website, you can, a bit like, when someone says, oh, what are you doing your PhD on? And you're like, well, and 2 hours later. So it's nice to have that one line so they'll just leave you alone. But it's also nice to have a tagline for a podcast for yourself, because if you come up with a one sentence, 10, 15 word description of your podcast, and I do this all the time, you think of a potential topic and then you kind of say to yourself, okay, does this topic with this guest does that actually work in, like, if I made this episode, would it be described by this tagline? And if you kind of say, I don't know, not really, if I'm honest with myself, or really this is for a different show or a different type of thing, and then you can kind of scrap it. Or you can kind of say, well, kind of, but I think I need to do more with some other part of it, or I need to focus on something different, or bring in another guest, and it'll nudge it back kind of on the path of what you're trying to do. So something like that, some sort of like central idea or tagline or description of your show for yourself can kind of help you keep on track. And as Tristan was saying, kind of when you're thinking about future episodes, you're kind of thinking, well, yes, this will work and this will work. And I do this all the time with my own show, where I kind of say, it's supposed to be a storytelling podcast, and I don't really have a story here. I have a good guest or I have a good topic, but I'm not really sure how I'm going to get from the beginning to the end. And then, as you're saying, just talking about podcast structure, you know, I probably spend about the same amount of time on the first 3 to 5 minutes of my episodes than I do the remaining 25, 30 minutes, in terms of both thinking about them, sound designing them, thinking about what I want to say at the beginning. Because I think for me, I kind of do the same when I'm writing articles or essays. I always spend so much longer. I need to get the beginning right before I can get the rest. And I think that's kind of just for me. But obviously for a listener, you know, you've got a couple of minutes to convince someone to listen to the rest of the episode. And people have things to do. They have other podcasts to listen. So if the first 3 minutes are rubbish, doesn't really matter that there is another 27 minutes or whatever. You know, you need to sort of get that right. So I think that's just something else in terms of thinking about structures, to really think about the first 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, and then sort of take it from there. And, you know, it can afford to flag a little bit between minutes 21 and 23 or whatever, because you've sort of got people in. That the stats sort of suggest that for most, like, you know, podcasting is very opt-in. It's hard to find a podcast relative to like scrolling through social media or flicking through the channels on TV. So the audience is sort of very opt-in. They need to want to find you. And when they do, they want to listen. So once they're in, they're in. And most podcast listeners listen to most of an episode, even if it's 3 hours long. But you do need to sort of get them over that little hump initially to be like, you know, this is worth listening to. Stick with me, kind of thing. So there are 2 things just to think about.
Yeah. We're getting a couple of questions that we could, like, you know, we can spare the last 10 minutes for our questions. So please be with us. Tristan, let's talk about, you know, each, like a single episode. Like, how do we, what is the best? I mean, of course, there's no right or wrong way of, managing your time. But what do you think about that? Like, you know, managing your time, interviewing a guest, and what if the conversation evolves and you take more than the expected time? So, what do you think about those?
I think the thing is, interviewing a guest is like a skill that you need to learn, and it's something you need to develop, and that takes time and experience. And it's one of those things that you will find easier to do. I remember I actually draw upon a wee bit of my when I was younger. I worked in a call center, and I remember one of my colleagues saying to me that, like, when taking a call with somebody difficult is kind of like letting somebody into your house. The thing is, at all times, you're the person serving the lemonade. You know, you're the person making the cups of tea. Somebody doesn't come into your house, well, unless you know them very well, and they don't go and rummage around your cupboards. You are the one serving the tea. You're the host. And when you're doing an interview, you have to remember that you are the host and that your guest is here in your home, in your podcast. And it's up to you to make them feel comfortable and, you know, like happy. I think for most part, the best conversations I've ever had with people is when they feel like I'm being sincere and honest, and, you know, that they feel comfortable. And sometimes I'll do this, I'll do this most episodes, where before we start recording, I'll have a little chat. I'll kind of break the ice a little bit. I'll kind of explain where I'm coming from. Now, in contrast to Conor, I have a very conversational style. So I'm known online as the anarchaeologist, and I like to bring a little bit of anarchy to everything, because I think that's the spice of life. You know, that's the little bit of things that you need to do to keep things interesting. And when I do that, I look at like when I'm asking my guest questions, I take stuff I've researched, I've looked at those questions, but I'm always aware that the guest might have something that they say that could really be an interesting tangent, or most often than not, I'm really genuinely interested. Like, wait, but what about this? You know, if I'm involved in the process of interviewing a guest, I'm involved. You know, I start off with a series of question and answers, kind of like, but then I'll spiral out when I feel like, wow, actually, this is really, really interesting. Now that works for when you're really, really engaged in something. And that's maybe where I'm quite lucky, because I've always had the narrative and the vision of I'm doing stuff that nobody else is doing because nobody else either wants to or has thought about it like this. And so when I'm doing putting a show episode together, like my ideas first is, who am I talking to? What can I ask them? What can I gain? What can we bring out to the audience? And then I'll title it, you know, and then I'll think about, I don't really have very much at the start, apart from kind of like a little couple minutes, and then I'm straight into the interview. And I do kind of like a long form interview. I don't really cut anything up, because for me, the important bit in that show is the conversation. So this comes to a very important point about podcasting, is that it's a medium, it's a set of tools, it's a set of things that you can do. And when you're thinking about doing these episodes, you have to think, well, what do I want to do with these paintbrushes, these carving tools? What do I want to do? Do I want to have an intro where I'm doing lots of sound design like Conor does? And it sounds great, by the way. I really like Conor's podcast. I'm not just buttering up, I really do. And do you want to do that, or do you want to just hop straight in and be like, hey, everybody knows what the show's about, let's get to the good stuff, let's get to the guest? And that's ultimately, that's the best thing, is that it is about what you want to choose. And if you kind of get to the core of the episode of like, what are you trying to communicate? You know, is this a guest that you're discovering absolutely new stuff from? Or if, like, for example, if I'm speaking to another archaeologist, as an archaeologist myself, you know, what is the conversation between us? What is there a question that me as an archaeologist can ask another archaeologist that just, amplifies that kind of sense of discussion? And I think these, as you said yourself, Thilini, there's no right way of doing this, but there are lots of questions you can ask yourself, and there's lots of times that you can try things out. I'm sure both yourself and Conor have had episodes that have never aired because it didn't work. We've all done it. It happens. Everybody's got at least a couple, you know, and that's okay. Because what you do put out, that's what matters, you know. So
yeah. And Conor and Tristan, both of you, like, have you ever had the pre kind of discussions before you actually get into the interview with them? Have you been like, just talking by email or any other platform? Because like I said, I was very nervous. I was a very less confident and like a grad student, and I was very nervous as to how should I do this. And I always used to have like meet them beforehand for 30 minutes and discuss, okay, this is what is going to happen, and this is kind of like, what are you comfortable with, which area should we talk about? So we have a chat, but with later, when I got more comfortable with podcasting, I thought, okay, so I think I'm okay to sort of have that conversation probably on email, and exchange a couple of ideas and then go straight into the interview. What do you think about that, Tristan and Conor, both of you?
Yeah,
Conor, you want to go first?
Yeah, like I kind of find, like, so in work we would make some shows for people where we would, as a producer, I would do a pre-interview, but I'm not the host, so I would just find out what they know, get some good little bits of information, and I'll make some questions for the host and send them across to them. And occasionally those pre-interviews will be terrible, and I have to really tactfully say to the host, I don't think we should interview this person, just because they're so dull or whatever. And in that case, the pre-interview has really worked because it saved a terrible episode. But that doesn't happen that often. Most of the time, you can get something out. For my own show, I don't really do pre-interviews, partly because I'm wary of taking up too much of people's time. They're giving me a good chunk of their time. I rarely talk to people for less than an hour, and I feel really sort of grateful for that. And I don't want to be like, will you come on and talk to me for half an hour, and then we'll come on another time. People have suggested it before, and I've gone, no, it's fine, don't worry. I do send on, I don't send on questions in advance because I think that kind of interrupts the flow a bit, but I give people like discussion points. Here's the areas we're going to be talking about, especially with academics. They may have been researching different areas, and the thing I want to talk to them about is not their current research area. It might be their previous kind of area, and so they need to just sort of, remember a few things about it. So I would tend not to do pre-interviews in that way, but I would go back and forth on email. I would ask them what they're researching now, and whether they have any stuff they want to send me. People will sometimes send me articles they're writing or things like that in advance. Very often, though, I may have heard the person at a conference. I might just know them from various contacts, or sometimes they might have a talk. They might have been on a podcast themselves, or be on YouTube. Or I would definitely say, if you're trying to get somebody, have a look around online, and especially these days, so many people are delivering stuff online, and just see what their presentation style is like. And if you find like, maybe they're not actually the greatest person to talk about this subject, maybe there's somebody better. You don't have to have the really awkward thing of like interviewing somebody and then saying, oh God, that was terrible. And I don't know, the way I make my show, I cut up the interviews a lot anyway. I tend to record for an hour and maybe use 15 minutes of what they've said. So even if they're like, and I tell them this in advance, but even if they're maybe not like really, really engaging, I can usually use the more engaging parts of it. But it's very different when you're doing a straight on interview show where you're talking, they're talking, and you might record for an hour and put out 40-50 minutes or something like that. So there's advantages and disadvantages, I guess, really. But personally, for my own show, I don't.
And there have been instances where I've failed terribly at the interviews. But something that I decided was not to edit that part out and allow people to read that as a text, a whole text in itself, all those hedges, all those, kind of like the mistakes that you make and everything like, so it was kind of like part of the narrative, and just allowed it to be smoothly integrated into the whole conversation. Tristan, what do you think about the fact that, having these pre-interviews and all that?
I think it's really good. I get a lot of my guests from Twitter because I'm terminally online, and that's how a lot of people know me. But I'm quite interested, actually. I've got a quick question for Conor, because I'll preface this with, I struggled at the start with getting people to talk to me on a podcast, because a lot of people were worried that what they say would get cut up and chopped and changed around to fit a narrative. Obviously not what Conor's doing. Conor's doing something, actually, proper. But especially in anthropology and archaeology, there is definitely the talking head problem where, experts are interviewed about a huge range of things, and then they're cut up and their little sentences are put into like a flat Earth documentary or, an ancient aliens documentary. And honestly, I wish I was lying. It was a big, genuine fear people had. So, my kind of response to that was to make sure, to reassure people. So definitely at the start, I had a couple of calls beforehand with people. And then we always, as a process on the Archaeology Podcast Network, is we do allow a review time before the episode goes up if people are worried. And usually even just offering that to our guest is reassurance enough, because if we didn't, because we're offering it, that's the reassurance there. But I think as people know more about what I do and what basically the brand of the Archaeology Podcast Network, we find that less and less people were worried about that. But it's still there. And I think I think when this is coming back to what I was saying earlier about reassuring the guest, it's about trust and confidence. I think that it doesn't matter how it comes, like if you're worried about like, oh, my interview style's not that great, I don't really think that's the biggest issue. What's really what you want to do is have your guests have confidence in you, and the trust is there that you are going to present them in a great way. That's what you want to do. And I think the other point is that like I don't think I think like I think everybody's redeemable. I don't believe in a boring guest. I think that there's a nugget of gold in everybody, but I will admit it's more difficult in certain topics to make that interesting and accessible. Because at the end of the day, the interview depends on who your audience is and what information you're trying to convey. But if somebody knows how you interview already, if they've listened to a lot of your episodes, that really helps in understanding how they will talk to you, how you will talk to them as well. So that's kind of like, I think having a pre kind of chat with people is good, especially if they're nervous and they need it. But I think a couple of emails, a couple of Twitter DMs or Instagram DMs, I think that's good enough. And at the end of the day, if you've been doing enough podcast episodes, people know what to expect from you and your show, and that works in your favor.
Yeah, I think as well, just lay it out in the email. Like, I mean, I would normally email someone and say, look, this is who I am, this is what I do. I often try and make a kind of a connection. So very often, just like, the way academic worlds are, I might say, hey, I've actually interviewed someone else in your department, or somebody else that you probably know because they're quite a big name in that very specific field. So you're kind of getting a bit of name recognition. They go, oh, okay, well, if this person agreed to be on the show, then, there must be some merit to it or whatever. I'll have a look. And then I'd usually say, there's a whole back catalog of episodes to listen to here, insert link. Given your area of expertise, you might like to have a listen to this one. And I'll just suggest one that's kind of somewhat similar to theirs. And then, like people will come back and say, nearly always they'll have listened to an episode or a part of an episode, or at least pretend they've listened to one before they come back. And they'll say, yeah, listen, that sounds great. I mean, people say no, and that's fine. But other people will say, yeah, that's great. I had to listen to the episode. Sounds really good. I know such and such a person. And yeah, I'd love to be on the show. And at that point, in my book, they've agreed. I lay out the type of show, what I want to talk about, and I tell them that I'm going to be heavily editing it, but I don't give them any option at that point to, like, once they talk to me, I'm making that episode. I don't give them any editorial control or any say in the final product. But I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I do give them loads of opportunities to sort of, understand what they're getting into. And I guess it's the same as any like media interview or anything like that. So yeah.
A lot to talk about, and I keep reminded of things that are going to be very interesting. One thing that we need to also talk about is the concept. Being podcasters, especially in the field of humanities, I think that's going to be a huge challenge. And at the same time, we also have like kind of like a way to kind of shoulder as humanities scholars. So how do you think people from humanities, I'm sure this is being spoken at a different panel, but I think roughly if we can talk about how as humanities scholars we could, perhaps our podcast can be a medium of, talking about the current status of the humanities and how we could, kind of resurrect it from what has happened to it, with all neoliberal kind of education. Tristan, and let's about more to Tristan. What do you think is, what can we do as humanities podcasters, or if anyone who intends to start a podcast as a humanities researcher or a scholar, how can they sort of conceptualize this in a way that it kind of like amplifies the voices of the humanities people?
I think the really important thing is to have a mission statement. And what I mean by that is it's a much more abstract thing of, it's not a tagline, it's not the name of your podcast, it's what do you want to do? At the end of the day, you're the unique selling point of a podcast, somebody can just record stuff on their phone, chatting with their friends and upload it, the important thing is when you make something that's beneficial to others, that has a meaning and has a focus, or it has an end goal, like I think the humanities they don't have a lot of advocacy in of themselves. I think it's very easy for a number of social political reasons for people to look at, like, for example, STEM subjects and basically say, well, look, these work in all these different manufacturing industry, technology fields, the general public's knowledge linking STEM subjects to STEM subjects to like science and innovation is very strong. And humanities, I just think the association is not there, or it's poor, because we know that like anthropologists work in many different fields. We know people who have English majors work in many different fields. I think the humanities in general, there's a number of different steps to this. So number one, it's communicating with the public the benefits of the humanities as an area of research and understanding. The second is also a focus inward of the humanities to understand itself better and make itself better. I think, it's especially in archaeology, I think we have a number of very serious issues in terms of representations, in terms of diversity, in terms of who gets the spotlight. And I think that there's a democratizing kind of process that happens with podcasting that can lift voices up that aren't usually heard. And that has to be almost disruptive. And I think that's why podcasting is great, because you can invest a lot of time and effort and money into it. But at the same time, you can use very basic tools to create something that can sound very professional and real, and more importantly, authentic. And I think the authenticity in podcasting is one of the great powers there. And I think that both facing outward to the world and demonstrating what power and benefit the humanities have, but also inwardly asking ourselves, how can we do better, are two ways and two facets of podcasting and just general media creation that really show how beneficial doing this is. So that's kind of, yeah, sorry, I went off a wee bit there, but I think the benefit is there to just understand and communicate, and as you've mentioned as well, Thilini, bring voices to the fore that may not usually be heard.
Absolutely. Conor, anything to add to this?
I was actually just intrigued to see what you have to think, Thilini, because you're obviously that's really the focus of your podcast. Yeah.
So for me, like one of the most important things was like Tristan said, like bringing those voices or those positions, very precarious positions, probably in the academia or in the humanities field, bringing them to the fore, and that was what I wanted to do. And one of the things that I really liked about how my podcast evolved was the fact that those diverse kind of voices, it's kind of like a combination of people from diverse backgrounds, people from diverse experiences, and things to say about the humanities and its crisis, both from the global north and the global south. And I think that was one of the greatest things that I like about it. On the other hand, there can be things that you think, okay, I should think about the biases of my subject position as a host, as a person who's mediating this conversation and all that. But that's also for us to think about at the beginning of a podcast. Conor, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think especially your average humanities scholar starting a podcast already has the skills to be very critical and self-critical and self-aware of a lot of the topics that maybe your average podcaster isn't necessarily thinking about. And I think just generally there's a lot of skills that you have as a researcher and a scholar which you can bring to your own podcast, not just the actual content and the structure and so forth, but to, as both of you are saying, to why you're podcasting, who you're trying to reach, what you're trying to change by discussing these topics, or what you're trying to, it doesn't have to be like a world-changing podcast, but in its own way, it can highlight discussions that aren't discussed elsewhere. It can, at the very least, you would hope, bring what are typically discussions that happen in universities behind closed doors to a broader public. Because the usual outreach type things in universities, which involve having, it's an open lecture, anyone can come along to the lecture, but like nobody goes to lectures in universities except people who are used to going to universities and sitting in lecture halls and things. But the fact that you can interview anyone anywhere in the world and you can put it out on a very easy to access platform, you are much more likely to get people jumping into a podcast that is like something and discussing things they might hear in a university, but doesn't involve them sitting in a university or whatever. So I think this is important too.
Absolutely. We have a lot of things to talk about. I also think we have a couple of questions in the chat. Tristan and Conor, I'm worried if 10 minutes would be enough for us to sort of...
Let's blast through as many as we can. We'll get these questions answered.
I just noticed one there. This is cliche advice, but the best way to figure out whether your podcast will work is actually make the first episode worth and all. Yeah, I totally agree as well. Just jump in as well. I say make a few episodes in advance, but don't make like 200 episodes in advance. Next year will be the year I launch my podcast. You have to launch it at some point. Yeah. And I think you need to just pick a date and get it out there. Like that thing where you tell people you're going to run a marathon, so you have to run it. Tell people you're launching your podcast in 3 months, and then, you just have to do it. And just get it out and see what happens. And if it's a miserable failure, well, look, sure, you tried, dust yourself off, try a different show, give it another go. Yeah.
And we have like question, like, how do we know if our ideas are worth, being invested in, like, in a podcast? How do we know that? That's one of the questions that we've got.
Oh, Conor, do you want to take this, or do you want me to? I got some things to say about this.
Not everything should be a podcast. That's one thing, anyway.
But, au contraire, Conor. Yeah. Au contraire. I think that the decision to make a podcast and the ideas that you're talking about, like, as I've said before, you're the unique selling point. Even if an idea is like out there, or it's crazy, or it's just not something that people would expect every day. If you can make it special and if you can make it entertaining, then you win. I would say that, like, think about, in terms of the mission statement, think about 2-3 episodes ahead. Think about all these things about, like, well, how would somebody hear this? That's how you decide whether something's, compatible for a podcast. But the other side of it is that, like, I would, on paper, not rule anything out. I would give it a test, give it a go, give it a try and work out some of the things around it, and then decide whether you want to make this podcast or not. I do agree with Conor that there are some things that maybe aren't suited for podcasts, but I think giving things a try first is your best way of doing it. And sometimes, doing something that people don't expect is actually what's needed. I think in academia, we can get a wee bit stuck in our ways. And I think that new, fresh, and exciting, different things, even if they're not world changing, their existence alone can pave the way for other people to take that forward. So I would say that if you feel passionate about something and you feel like there's an idea that you can see all the branches of the tree extending out from that idea, I think you should really think about developing that. But if it doesn't work, as Conor said, you can always try something else. You can always try a different idea. It's not the end of the world.
Yep. And But what about interviewing guests? Probably I could ask this. I could ask this from Conor. So, if you want to interview a guest, do you first go with somebody who's less prominent, like a professor, or do we pick somebody who's very prominent in the field, who's very popular, so that it gives us publicity to our podcast? That's one of the questions that we have in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's slightly different as well in academia than it is in other areas. I mean, there's two sides to things. It's like, are you getting this guest because they're good, or are you getting this guest because they will promote your show? Mm-hmm. And there's an argument to say, get the big name guest, because they will boost your show and therefore make help lots of people hear all the other people on the show as well. But I think there's also the fact that not everybody who's a big name is actually very good at self-promotion, so you can get, and I found this with lots of stuff, you can get like really big guests on your show, but then they don't actually care about your show or anything to do with it, and there's no discernible bump in listenership because they haven't really done anything to boost the show. The sweet spot is a guest who's obviously good and well suited to your show, but also not necessarily very famous, just very good at self-promotion, that they have an interest in, for example, if you're doing a show on history, and you interview somebody who's just written a book on this subject, and maybe their publishers and everybody else want to get that out there. So you're going to get promotion, you're going to get listeners, you're going to get that person mentioning it on other things as well. It's a sad fact of life, but you get the social Instagram influencer on your show and you probably will get lots of more listeners. But even if you think that they're not really the right fit for your show, there are 2 million podcasts. You're throwing your one on the pile. Trying to get anybody to listen to that is going to be difficult. So you're going to need to do something to break through the noise, and there's different things you can do, but the most effective, or among the most effective ways, is to get a well-known person on your show who will then go away and promote the fact that they've been on that show. It works,
Great. Conor, you have another question, like what are the basic tips for beginners on making the best first 5 minutes production wise?
Yeah, I think it totally depends on the type of show. I think, like Tristan said, if it's an interview show and you are the host, I think you want to get quickly to the interview, because while people like you, obviously, that's why they're listening if you're the host, they also want to hear your guest, and they want to get straight to that. So you can use that time to kind of prefigure a couple of things that are coming up in the interview, or kind of get people hooked, get people interested, and get kind of quickly to that interview. If it's a kind of a chat show, when there's 2 or 3 regular co-hosts, it's, for the most part, it's the rapport that people come for. They like being the sort of extra person in the room, the person who's listening in on your conversation. So it's a different type of thing. So even if you perhaps have 2 co-hosts and then you have, say, an interview, or you have 2 co-hosts and then you get to sort of the main topic, it's that like 10-15 minutes of preamble that when you're just talking about absolutely nothing, which in fact is the thing that most fans really like about the show, and they find out little insights about you and your opinions and what you've done, and that sort of thing. It's a very different type of thing. You're selling your rapport with your co-hosts, and so the way you start that can seem really trivial, but actually that's what the fans are coming for, and that's how some of the biggest shows in the world are very, very successful that way. And then if it's something that's more edited and sort of closely scripted and so on and so forth, I think you need to get in. It doesn't need to be like an outright question, but a little bit like writing an academic article. You're kind of laying out your stall and you're saying, this is the problem or the issue, and here's how I'm going to talk about it, solve it, address it, shake it up, whatever it might be. But you kind of need to get that in the first couple of minutes. Maybe it's a mystery, maybe it's something intriguing, maybe it's something that you're going to reveal at the end, or maybe it's just something that you're coming at from a new angle or whatever it might be. But to try and get that in at the beginning, so the person knows, okay, if I stay to the end, then I'll have learned this, found out about this, found the answer to something, learned to think about something afresh, whatever it might be. But yeah, it'll depend a lot on the type of show, but a couple of ideas maybe.
Yeah, so we have like 5 minutes left for our discussion, and just wanted to let everybody know, if you are working with very, very little resources, there are a lot of ways of making your podcast a great one. And Tristan and Conor, if you would like to be contacted after this, would you like to type your emails in the chat or something, so that we could, if somebody wants to talk to you afterwards, they could talk to you?
Yeah.
One last thing before we wind up, I think it's one of the most important things. Let's talk about burnout. Like being a podcast host, and you start, developing your episodes, and burnout is very real. So in 2 or 3 minutes, let's just talk about that. Conor and Tristan. Tristan, will start with you. What do you think about that? How to avoid that possible cases?
This is a discussion that could last hours, because I think one of the biggest issues with podcasting is, as Conor said in the first couple of minutes, the amount of work you have to do as one person is just a lot, right? And I think the best thing you can do is become sustainable over trying to make quantity. This is about planning out to make your show sustainable. And what that means is that you aren't making a show that is too big, that you cannot handle. Put it into little chunks. And if you're struggling with doing a show in one way, let the show evolve and split it up. You could do, as Conor suggested, little runs and have 4 episodes ready and have them, every 4 weeks or something, and then, or every 2 weeks, and you have then the big gap where you can create the next ones. The other thing is I find burnout, I'm actually put my show on hiatus just a month ago, and I'm going to possibly getting a co-host in because I'm struggling to put out a show, and I find that really, really difficult, and I work best with other people. So my solution to my kind of burnout is to get somebody else to share that with. So it's a very complicated and complex topic, but I think there are ways of easing your own workload by either getting help or by changing and evolving your podcast.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you, Conor. Thank you very much for your very influential and very important ideas and observations and experiences. And I hope that we get a similar platform in future, where we could get together, connect, and do something of similar nature. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for being here. Thank you for the organizers. And I think we are going to head to the keynote now. And I hope you have a great seminar ahead.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Thilini.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Nice to hear.